knobs to turn it on and off were about as big as a horse's fetlock. All right? And when you turned it on, they had tubes, and you had to warm up for an hour. And sometimes all you had was 1 or 2 programs on a day on different channels. But by 1938, this is the eve of World War II, and remember, by 1938, there are problems in Europe. Hitler is on the march. Okay, the Munich conference had just taken place. Hitler had taken over part of Czechoslovakia. Prior to that, he had taken over the Rhineland and the Saar Basin and the Ruhr Valley. And the Italians had taken over Albania, and the Japanese are on the move, so war was in the air. And so a lot of people think that when Orson Welles did this thing called War of the Worlds on the radio, it really was an allegory, or it was some way to kind of compare what was happening in the world situation with the fear that Americans had about war, about being invaded. And eventually, in 1941, we were invaded. Well, Halloween night, 1938, there was a regular program called Mercury Theater of the Air. They had a series that year of about 20-some different programs. Most of them were classics. However, for Halloween night, they decided to have some fun, and they did an old H.G. Wells novel. And H.G. Wells wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. No, that was Jules Verne, I'm sorry. H.G. Wells wrote,
War of the Worlds.
Besides the War of the Worlds, he wrote...
The Time Machine.
The Time Machine, thank you very much. So he was kind of like in the Jules Verne tradition. But Orson Welles, no relation to H.G. Wells, this is many years later. The War of the Worlds was actually written back in the 1890s, way ahead of its time, because it dealt with aliens, etc., in outer space. But Orson Welles adapted it for the radio. In doing my research and reading about it, it's amazing. They had decided like a week before they were going to put it on the air to do this. So they assigned a writer who read the novel and then wrote this radio play. And then they got together and they rewrote it, made revisions, etc., etc. And Orson Welles, this young 24-year-old who's brilliant, a genius, later on he would produce what some people consider the greatest movie of all time. Does anybody know what it is? Citizen Kane. Okay, very good. As a young man, he was very creative, and he has a vision for what he wants on the radio that night. At 8 o'clock that night, after all the revisions, this goes on the air, and it was well advertised in newspapers and on the radio during the time. Orson Welles presents H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, a Halloween special. This is the young Orson Welles here. I think this is actually a picture of him as he was doing the broadcast. Remember, the radio was all imagination. You couldn't see what was going on. Talk to anybody that lived back at that time, and they'll say that in some ways they liked radio better than television, because you could sit there in the dark with your family, listen to the radio, and your imagination would paint all the pictures for you. And Orson Welles just had a way with words. He was able to do that. On that Devil's Night, 1938, he starts the program as if it is a special of Tchaikovsky music. He starts off with Tchaikovsky's first piano concerto. Does anybody know it? Da 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 da. You know it? And the thing is that he had arguments with the other producers of this. Orson Welles let that play interminably for minutes and minutes and minutes and minutes, because Orson Welles wanted people listening to kind of believe that this was really what this was an orchestral program that will be interrupted by a simple news flash, and you'll hear it on the radio probably on the way back if you're interested.
Yes.
I think you might be interested to hear the actual broadcast. And they come in with a simple thing saying, we have a news bulletin, observers at and they don't use the actual government names, but I think they say the government observatory in Washington, D.C. or wherever, have reported seeing strange flashes on the planet Mars. We now return you back to our regularly scheduled program of music. And they go into it, and the music plays again forever and forever. So people who are listening to this are thinking that was just a real news broadcast. The problem is, back then they didn't have station breaks. They would basically go straight through the program. However, and some of you have heard of this before, haven't you? This War of the Worlds scare. At 4 different times during the hour, they did break in and announce, you are listening to an adaptation of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, put on by the Mercury Theater of the Air. In fact, I think even at the very beginning, they mentioned it, but some people tuned in from another program. A lot of people that night were listening to a comedian show called Charlie McCarthy, Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Some of you have heard of Candace Bergen, the daughter of Edgar Bergen. He was a very famous ventriloquist. Let me tell you, the easiest job in the world is to be a ventriloquist on the radio.
Because nobody can see you move your lips.
Stop and think about it. Exactly. You're right. I mean, I could even do that. So people are listening to that. But during the commercial breaks on that program, apparently a lot of people are turning their radio dials to see what else is on. And when they turn it, if they turned it and came in right when the music was ending and they're making another one of their news flashes, because the second news flash would be something like, flares have now been shown coming off of Mars, apparently heading toward Earth. You'll hear that again. And so they constantly, throughout this hour, build it up. And people that are listening to that part, if they listened to the whole program, they would have known it was a drama. They would have known it was a Halloween special. But a lot of people listen to certain parts of it, and that's when they panicked and they got scared. And as a result of people not listening to the whole thing and the fact that there weren't any station breaks or anything like that, the next day, in the headlines of the Boston Daily Globe, radio play terrifies nation. Now, from my research, there are no reports of anybody committing suicide, but panic is panic, terror is terror. And apparently some people were packing up their belongings, some people were loading up their shotguns, because as you know, if we're attacked by a superior civilization from interstellar space, a shotgun would be the best weapon to use against them, apparently. But it did terrify a lot of people that listened to it. The thing is, if people were listening to it, I know myself, if I turn on CNN and there's a special report of something, sometimes I'll turn to MSNBC to see what they're saying about the same thing. If people had turned to another station, they would have gone, well, that's odd. There's a, comedy
Terry.
show on still.
Terry.
Yeah.
But as you said, there wasn't many stations on at the same time. It's not like
Right.
an overflow of information. You can't go on the internet or check your phone. All they had was a couple of stations that were there.
Exactly. So, people just didn't have the opportunity like they would have today. Or
Yeah.
they couldn't check things on Twitter or, contact their friends. Although people were calling other people saying, did you hear what's happening? We're being invaded by Martians. Well, as you listen to the radio program, as they go on, it should be obvious to anybody who listened to the whole thing, who believed it at first, that wait a minute, there's something wrong here. Because 10 minutes ago there were flashes on Mars, and now all of a sudden, 20 or 30 minutes later, New York City is all devastated and the army has been called out and everything else. All that couldn't have happened in that short period of time. So it was obviously the drama was compressed, just like any movie or anything else that shows a certain period of time. But people are gullible, and remember, however, the time period. And that is, people have war on their mind and they were worried, and that's what happens. If you are in a frame of mind, and David can talk more about this as a psychologist, but if you are predisposed to believe something, and David and I agree on this statement that we mentioned it once already, there's the old saying that I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Okay, everybody says that. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it. But the opposite is, or the converse is also true. I wouldn't have seen it if I didn't believe it. In other words, if you believe something, you'll see it. If you believe there was a face in that window at the Lizzie Borden house, you'll see it. If you believe there are ghosts in your attic, you'll find evidence for it. And we have to be careful about that kind of thing as educated people as to what we're predisposed to believe. Because, the question is, what is reality? Well, the reality for these people was the state of the world situation. And when this program came on, they were predisposed to believe anything like this. The next day, during the broadcast, there were so many phone calls to the police, especially in the area of Grover's Mill, which is just a little bit north of where we are right now. The radio station in New York City where this emanated was flooded with police officers, and they wanted to break into the studio and stop the play. And of course, Orson Wells made sure the doors were locked, and there was a real hullabaloo there at the radio station. So the law is involved. Now, did he break any laws by doing this? No, but do you think new laws are put into place as a result of this? Yes, that's why to this day, that's why we included it in crime and punishment, because it wasn't, in terms of crimes, it wasn't the murder of Andrew Gordon and his wife, but it still could have caused a lot of problems in terms of injuries or even possible deaths because of this. And so because of this, you have to be very careful when you put on some kind of a spoof or whatever. And to this day, radio stations, television networks, they have to, I think every 15 minutes, they have to have a station break so that people will know that, wait a minute, this is just, it's something other than what I'm thinking here. So anyway, that's basically the story of what happened at Grover's Mill. But to this day, Grover's Mill, New Jersey is the only place in the world that was ever invaded by Martians in 1938.